Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us live on both Facebook and YouTube from Simon & Schuster for our speculative fiction panel conversation featuring some amazing authors. Today joining me, I have Elle, Chloe Gong, and Sarah Raughley. I'm Emily from Riveted by Simon Teen. Before we dive in, I want to let you know about a sweepstakes we are holding in the comments of both the YouTube stream and the Facebook. If you'd like to be entered for the chance to win 3 of the books we are discussing today, just leave a question in the comments. 3 lucky winners will each receive a copy of Wings of Ebony, Our Violent Ends, and The Bones of Ruin. And we may answer your question during the broadcast. And now let's get to it. I'd like to welcome our special guests and allow them to introduce themselves and their newest books. Jess, will you kick us off, followed by Chloe and then Sarah?
Sure. Thank you, Emily. I am Elle, the author of Wings of Ebony and its sequel coming out. Oh, I guess it's right here, huh? Coming out in January. It is the duology is about a teen, Rue, who is from an inner city community who must lean into her ancestors' magic to protect both her home and the magical island she didn't know she was from.
Should I go next?
Go for it.
Hello, I'm Chloe Gong. I'm the author of Our Violent Ends, which is the sequel to the book that came out last year, These Violent Delights. It's a complete duology that is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet set in 1920s Shanghai, following the 2 heirs of these gangs in a war. You know, just normal teenagery blood feud stuff. And they have to work together when a monster rises in their city and starts killing all of their people. So in order to save their city, they have to work with their worst enemies, who might also be their greatest loves. You know, just those funny things.
And hello. I'm Sarah Raughley, author of The Bones of Ruin. Here's a little bookmark because I don't actually have the book with me. But it is a 19th century supernatural Hunger Games set in Victorian London about an African tightrope dancer who is battling in a magical tournament against other supernatural folks. So we love magical tournaments. Don't we?
Awesome. There are so many things to love in all your books, and I cannot wait to talk about them. So my first question is for everyone. Can you share what inspired you to write your book? And we can just go in the same order we did intros in.
Sure. Yeah. I think, the inspiration came from a lot of things. I think initially I loved the idea of creating a Wonder Woman type character who felt very just powerful and like bigger than life. And I thought it would be really cool to make that character someone who was from an inner city neighborhood like mine, because I'd never seen that before. And so it started with that. And then as Rue, my main character, started to tell me her story, I realized that there were a lot of real world parallels that I was feeling pulled to explore, such as racism and privilege and allyship. And so the book, the more sort of edits and revisions it went through, it took on sort of its own form and became sort of a commentary that is fairly relevant to the real world. So
Yeah, so for me, it was because I wanted to write a blood feud story, and I have grown up reading YA fantasy, and I really loved all of those angsty things about like star-crossed love and like fighting against your family and all of those things that are very familiar to us on the shelves. But specifically, I wanted to do it in a setting that I had heard all of these stories about that I had never seen explored before, which ended up being 1920 Shanghai, because I had kind of grown up with stories that my parents would tell or they would put on TV from like Chinese media, whereas the stories that I was reading off the shelves were just, Throne of Glass, Divergent. I was like, I love them, but they didn't have the kind of representation that I wanted to see. So I mushed it together and I thought, okay, I'm going to tell my very archetypical star-crossed lovers YA fantasy story and then set it in a setting that I've never seen before, that gives its whole new spin on something that's so quintessentially like Western canonical literature, but a lens that we haven't really seen explored enough for the diaspora readers out there. And it kind of just became this mishmash of genres that now we have.
As for me, I'm a huge geek. I mean, I love all kinds of anime, manga, and high fantasy, video games, Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, that kind of stuff. And I've always loved the idea of creating something that's like epic fantasy scope, but within the real world. So when it comes to the Bones of Ruin, I also love 19th century books and movies like Sherlock Holmes. And I wanted to sort of create something that was epic fantasy, but in 19th century London. And the thing about a lot of books and stories set in 19th century London is that you don't get a lot of Black people. You don't get a lot of stories featuring Black people or people of color in general. And you'd be surprised how many people don't even realize that there were Black people in London and Europe before the 20th century, even way back, way back, centuries back. So I really wanted to repopulate Victorian London with Black people, and especially with a Black female heroine who is coming into her own power.
I love hearing all of this inspiration. It's so cool. Another question for everyone. Each of your books takes place in the real world, but with some sort of magical element. So I'm wondering what encouraged you to add that little bit of magic?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I actually, I think about that a lot because I love reading contemporary. Like Chloe was saying, we grew up reading YA fantasy and we love it, but I obsessively read contemporary just as much. So it was like when I came to this crossroads of what is this book gonna be? I honestly was like, okay, this is a girl in her neighborhood. She's just totally regular girl. And by page 3, there was magic. So part of it I think is just instinctual. I needed the boundless reality that is fantasy. And then I think too, once I realized sort of the depth and the layers and the nuance in the story that I was writing, I thought fantasy was a great aesthetic to explore sort of, realities that may not be, justices that may not have been realized in the real world. I can write things that are not real in this fantasy space to sort of figuratively put power, magic in the character's hands and thus the reader's hands. So I liked the vibe of that, and I thought that it was a very empowering aesthetic to put such a sobering story within.
I also really love this question because sometimes I kind of sit down and think okay, my book is marketed as a YA historical fantasy, but if you really look at it, you put it under a microscope, technically it's YA historical sci-fi thriller mystery horror. If you really look at the conventions and tropes, right? Because technically there is no magic in this duology, but there is a monster and there is a madness and there's some sort of cause running through the plot that obviously didn't exist in true history. So what I was trying to do was I wanted to add on this extra component that kind of made tangible what was currently going on in history that I really wanted to explore. So even though These Violent Delights in Our Violent Ends is this blood feud story, it's ultimately about these characters and their blood feud, there is still this anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism commentary running through the whole thing, because it was really important to me to showcase what has been kind of brushed under the rug in depictions of this time period and this place, especially in Western media, when it's more leaning towards, oh, look, it's the British guy marching into the city and he's going to save the day, even though it's why are you here in the city? Let's think about this. Which war did you win before you got into the city? Anyway, I wanted to look at these very high level historical ideas, but I thought it's very hard to actually visually see that. And so I thought, okay, let's put a monster in. Let's make this monster wreaking havoc through the city kind of physically represent exactly what you kind of feel is going going on in terms of damage to the city, but you can't necessarily see. So the role that, like, you know, magic in the sense that I've used it is to kind of emphasize what is, like, in the historical sense and the real life sense that you can't really properly verbalize, but as soon as you bring in supernatural elements, it becomes much easier to bring to the forefront.
Yeah, you know, I'm just going to echo what everyone has said. I think having read all of your books and having written my book, I think the common thread that you see in all of them is that there's fantasy matched with this sort of anti-colonial commentary. And I think one powerful thing about speculative fiction and fantasy is that it kind of gives you a new way through which you can, you know, explore a lot of the issues that, you know, sometimes go unexplored in society. You know, the things that you really want to talk about, the things that may be difficult to talk about, you can do that through magic and fantasy and adventure and, you know, lampshade a lot of those social issues. And on top of that, it's just fun, you know, like I've never been that much of a contemporary girl. I guess I've read some series here and there that that are contemporary, obviously literary, but fantasy is just close to my heart. I love that idea of just being able to escape and have fun as well. So
Wonderful. I am seeing some great audience questions come in. So this is a reminder for anyone watching that if you ask a question, you will be entered for the chance to win 3 of the books we're talking about today. That's Wings of Ebony, Bones of Ruin, and is it These Silent Lights? Or did I do Our Violin Ends? Oh, I did Our Violin Ends. The new one. Very exciting. So keep those questions coming, but I have some more questions in the meantime. My next question is for Jess and Chloe. So Wings of Ebony and These Violent Delights were your debut novels. I'm curious about how was the experience of writing the sequel, Ashes of Gold and Our Violent Ends? Was it similar or was it super different? I feel like either of you can jump in if you're ready.
I can go if you want. So the experience was very different for me for a couple of reasons. First off, the narrative in Ashes of Gold is different. I made an intentional pivot narratively in the duology to sort of echo a larger message that, you know, Black heroines, particularly Black heroines fighting racism, don't exist to only fight racism, right? They should be allowed to have crushes and be kissed and like have all of these other things that are nostalgic to teenagehood. So in book 2, I specifically set out to anchor the story using seeds I planted in book 1 when it was more focused on Rue dealing with racism. In book 2, I really watered the seeds of like the love triangle that I created because one, I just love a good romance. I love a good romance thread in a book. But I wanted to specifically explore that. So the experience of writing Ashes was different because I wrote Wings of Ebony, which if you've read it is it takes a very unflinching look within the realm of magic, but a very unflinching look at racism and privilege and allyship. And there were definitely parts of that book that were very difficult emotionally to write, to read, to edit, to revise, just very emotionally taxing. And then going into promoting that book, which came out in January of 2021 after living through 2020, because I had written it before 2020. It just was unfortunately very relevant to conversations. And again, you're constantly dwelling on sort of like all of those things. That was one of the moments where I was super grateful that I did write fantasy because there's so much hope in Wings of Ebony. Like it's not a book about trauma. It's a book about hope. And it's a book about love, like love for community. And in book 2, I got to lean into more of the love interests, which was really fun because this book was due at the end of the summer. So if anybody remembers what the world was like, summer 2020, it was very difficult as a Black woman. And so this book was a blanket to me in many ways because I got to write cute kissy moments. I won't do any spoilers, but like I got to really lean into those pieces of her life that I needed. And it was hard to write a book on a deadline with the world on fire, but it has so much of like the joy and love and comfort that I felt very free to explore those things in that book. So the experiences were very, very different for me.
Oh, I really love that. Hope. It's always about hope. Yeah, for me, I think the biggest difference between book one and book two, I think, was the craft aspect, because I had torn apart book one multiple times. I think it had a whole level rewrite at least twice to move whole plot events into very different places, to rewrite the ending. Just it was under construction for a very, very long time. And then book two, I wrote in a very like I kind of entered like a fever dream period, because I wrote it after COVID hit and we went into lockdown and I was kicked out of school because all the schools shut down. They were like, international students, get out. And I went home, and there was, because New Zealand was on very, very intense lockdown for a long time. So I was only at home and there was nothing else I could do but write. And so book two became like my refuge place where I just sunk into it and I just didn't think of anything else but writing it. And it came together within, I think, either a month or two. And then I think I did like one light round of edits to change like 2 chapters. And then we went straight to line edits. So it felt like incredibly different experiences because of how long book two had been living in my head as an idea while I was doing book one. And then I had all of this time to go putting it together craft-wise. Whereas book one felt more like an experiment where I was like cobbling this together and then, okay, this works now, but then this other part doesn't work. Let's do that again. Let's try that again until it's perfect. Whereas book two was kind of like a lot was just going on. And I was like, okay, this book is just my child now. I will focus on nothing but nurturing it to life. And it worked, I guess. So craft-wise, it felt very, very different as like as an author and as like a creative person. They felt like completely different things, even though it's the same world.
I always love hearing about the writing process. It's so interesting. I have a question for Sarah and Jess. Both of your heroines uncover a secret magical heritage. Did anything in your own heritage inspire this?
I guess I'll go. In terms of my heritage, I mean, there are different ways that you can think of that in terms of cultural heritage and just my own past. I think it's less my cultural heritage and just more sort of my experiences, I suppose, in discovering myself, and learning and growing. And that's the thing about heroines. Oftentimes people say they want, relatable heroines, but then when you have heroines with weaknesses, people complain like, why would she do that? Why would she make that mistake? I would never do that. And it's like, well, this is really a coming of age story, even though Iris is technically, she can't die. So she doesn't really know how old she is. But she's still very much in that mindset of a teenager, trying to figure out who she is. And sometimes that means making a lot of mistakes. Sometimes you do things that are disagreeable and other people might kind of look at you and say, why would you do that? But that's all part of the growing process, and definitely part of the process that I went through growing up and that I'm still going through. So, I would say in terms of heritage, that's kind of, how I interpret it. And I did bring a lot of my sort of Nigerian sort of heritage in terms of, creating the world. The world isn't necessarily Afrocentric, but I made sure that there was a focus on, what Black and African people were really doing in 19th century London, which is something that you don't normally see focused on. So I'm happy that I was able to do that.
I think, I would say my answer is very similar to Sarah's. I did not literally discover magical lineage in my family, unfortunately. But I'm going to keep searching. I've been searching since I was like 5. But I would say that I drew more sort of on a metaphorical magic. that I believe my community, which the contemporary inner city community in Wings of Ebony, is modeled after the inner city community where I grew up, which is the 3rd Ward of Houston. Most people know it as where George Floyd is from. So that is my community. That's where I grew up. And I found there is a grit and a strength in my community that is very magical to me. And so I think that that is sort of the root of where that magic came from and where Roots magic comes from.
I love that. We have many more questions, but I'm going to go ahead and start taking some audience questions because we are getting some great ones. A reminder, if you're watching, you can be entered for a chance to win 3 books by asking a question. So sneak them on in. The first question is from AJ on Facebook. They ask, this is a question for everyone, if you could live in your books, which character would you be and why? And you're welcome to jump in if you're ready. That's a tough one.
I would absolutely not live in my book whatsoever. The world is coming to an end, so I'm cool sitting here in Hamilton. If I had to be, I think it would be interesting to be Rin. She's an Agoji warrior, you know, kind of like if you've watched Black Panther, the Dora Milaje, who are these like badass African warriors in what's the nation called for Black Panther again? I forget. Wakanda, right? They were actually based off of this real warrior battalion in the 19th century in Africa, the Dahomey Kingdom, which is now modern day Benin. And so I have a character named Rin who's actually from that particular battalion, and she's from the Reaper Regiment. And she's just so cool that I would just want to like fling around a magical sword and like slice people, slice and dice. So if you're going to be in the middle of the apocalypse, you might as well be a warrior, right? So
I love that mindset. I think it would be really cliche of me to say that I would just want to be Juliet because she's my main character. But I feel like if you're going to plant yourself into a completely lawless city where people are dying of a badness, like you may as well be the gang heir who has power. And like, you know, maybe gangster lifestyle is kind of on a decline. Maybe the duology is a tragedy and they're about to fall any second now. But while you're there and having fun, you may as well be the girl who like just swings around a gun, butting people, knocking them out all the time, right? Also, I wrote these Valentines when I was 19. So at the time I was writing it, all of my characters were 19. And obviously, Roma, the love interest, is 19. And I just modeled him as the ideal, like, boyfriend. So, you know, I've just frozen these characters permanently in time. And if I was transplanted back into 19-year-old Juliet, then I can date 19-year-old Roma. I think that's a great plan.
I'm so torn. I'm torn. I think I love Rue, and I would say normally my answer to this question or a question like this is Rue. But I'm going to go a different route this time and say it would actually be a character named Zora from the sequel. She is a Yakana warrior, and she is a so in the first book, Rue doesn't know a lot or really care much about her father's side of the family for reasons. You'll have to read to find out why. But in book 2, there's a lot more learning happening about that side of her family and learning more about the Gazani people as a whole. And Zora is one of the new characters that you meet in the sequel, and she's just really fierce. And the thing I love about Zora is that not only is she a warrior, and she's very, you know, she has a presence about her. Like, you know, people watch what they say when Zora's around because they don't want to be on her bad side. But like her heart is like as gooey as like frosting. She's so sweet and fiercely caring for the people that she loves. And I just love that. She's also plus size, which I adore. So
there's so many awesome warriors in your books. This next question comes from Camille on Facebook. This is for everyone again. What's your favorite part of the writing process? Hopefully that's easier than your least favorite part or maybe not.
I can go if we're still going in order. Favorite part of the writing process changes depending on what part of the writing process I'm in. So the answer is the part I'm not in. I used to be revising, but I have revisions staring me in the face right now. And so I can tell you that there's nothing more exciting than drafting. Honestly, I like to toggle between each. The grass is always greener on the side you're not doing. I see the magic and value in both of them, and they're obviously equally necessary. But I do feel like my creative brain is used differently, drafting versus revising. And I think that it's important to toggle between the two. So I feel like they're two sides of the same coin, and I need to keep flipping it so that either side works as needed.
I absolutely agree. I think both of them are so critical to the writing process, and I love them in different ways. I think if I really, really had to pick, I think I would lean more towards the first draft as my favorite part, because even though it's like hair tearing and like it's the end of the world while I'm doing it, there's something so magical about that first moment of creation that isn't quite like revising, right? Because revising, you're making it better and polishing it to be its ultimate potential. But first drafts always feel kind of like it feels special to me because it's that very first time I'm bringing a certain scene to life, and it kind of captures what being an author is like to me. It's like, wow, I'm really just making things up, and it feels real. Mind blown.
For me, having just finished a draft, I'm going to say the best part is once you're done, it's that beautiful space between once you're done the first draft and once you get your edits back from your editor. I love that like 2-3 week period where it's like, I'm done and I'm not going to even think about this book anymore. I'm finished and I just pushed it out of my mind and now I'm thinking about other things, because it's just a nice like breather before you dive back in. And you know that the process isn't finished, but you're kind of euphoric after finishing that first draft, like you finally finished it. And I finished book 2 for The Bones of Ruin not too long ago. So that whole process was like, again, the hair tearing. I think Chloe got it right. And then also the magic of creation, but just being able to like finish it and write the end is such a euphoric feeling that carried me on through those like weeks where I didn't have to like worry about writing or anything like that. So
That's great. I love all those answers. All right, I'm going to sneak in one final question. This comes from Heather on YouTube. This is for everyone. Have you gotten any advice from fellow authors that has stuck with you?
Yes, lots of advice. This one is more like publishing related. And it becomes more and more meaningful to me the more books I write. And it's from a dear friend, 2 friends actually, Saba Tahir and Nick Stone. They both said this to me in different ways. And it's basically like publishing is a long game. So you're not just the first book you write or the second. You're many, 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 many books. And you should sort of approach your career with that long game perspective in mind, instead of sort of like hanging your hat on like one book or one duology. Really sort of see your author career in a wide way and approach it that way. Because in the beginning, at least for me, when I wrote my debut, I was like, oh my gosh, this is the only book I'll ever be able to think of. Like I literally, when I was on sub with that book, 2 editors before it even sold, I had to physically stop checking my email because I wanted updates and like force myself to write another book. I didn't even know what the other book was going to be. I was just like, I have to write something else to prove to myself that I'm more than one book. And so I think that it's just sort of that awareness that you're looking forward at sort of like a collection of books that you will author over many years, and sort of being intentional about how you navigate that space.
I feel like I'm almost the I'm very anti-advice, and I say that in the nicest way, because I think to answer this question, actually, the advice that stuck with me the most, that I think I've just heard like many other authors echo, is that you have to take all advice, especially when it comes to how to write, like writing craft related, you have to take everything with a grain of salt. And I think that's what stuck with me the most, to always kind of ping pong between different pieces of advice and just take what is relevant to me and then brush off a lot of other pieces. Because I think writing is such a personal like act, and then what gets created out of it. Like books are so subjective. And I firmly believe that with so many big writing rules, what works for one person just does not work for another person completely. So I think the general advice to be careful what advice you take is the advice that stuck with me the most.
For me, it's funny because I actually teach writing at university. And this is a really great book that I've been teaching out of, Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird. And, I agree with the idea of, everyone's going to have different opinions and things like that. I would say that one of the best advice that I got from that book was not craft related. It was sort of psychologically, it was more in the realm of psychological. And writing is very much psychological, especially because, as JL mentioned, you want to think about your career. There's the business aspect of it. And what I've learned is everybody has their own journey. And thinking about yourself in comparison to others can really stop you in your tracks. That's the one thing. Everybody goes step by step. Some people, they crawl forward, and that's the writing journey. Some people, they explode onto the scene, right? And bestsellers, and they have all this and that. And other people, it's really a process of just going step by step by step, crawling forward, crawling up that mountain for their careers. And, for me, one thing that's helped me going is realizing that, I'm on my own journey and I love writing. And as long as I love writing and as long as I love my own journey, I'm just going to keep doing it. I'm going to get as much advice as I can from as many people as I can, if that's what's going to help me, become a better writer, become a better, teacher, and a better storyteller. But I know that my journey is my own. So, if you're starting out as a writer and things aren't going your way, you don't have to look at other people's stories and say, well, I didn't get that 7-figure deal upon, my first ever book that I ever wrote, this and that. That's okay. Don't look at anybody else. Just be you and go on your own journey. And it'll eventually happen for you. But just like JL said, you want to play the long game. So think about the bird's eye view.
That's some really great advice from all of you. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I want to wrap up with a huge thank you to Jess, Chloe, and Sarah for joining us today. This was so insightful and thought-provoking and wonderful. And thank you to everyone at home for tuning in. We will hopefully see you again soon. Make sure, if you haven't read these authors' books, to pick up a copy. Make sure to follow them on social, and you can follow us at Simon Teen for more behind-the-scenes fun with our wonderful authors. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Emily.